Well, thank you so much for joining us on our very first Pivot Gaming podcast. If we go around and introduce ourselves, I'm Warren. I work at Pivot Search as a specialist gaming recruiter. Jordan?
I'm Jordan. I'm the talent acquisition manager at Bulkhead Interactive, live from my bedroom, as you can see.
Sean?
I'm Sean, a bit of everything. Currently work with E1M1 Magazine, do some words for Monster Vine, and work with Zoom platform. Not the video conferencing, but the video game platform.
Cool. Paul?
I'm Paul. I also work at Pivot Search as a video game specialist recruiter, I guess you could say.
Fantastic. Well, we're all here really in light of sort of a very recent LinkedIn poll that asked quite a poignant question. And the question was, which do you prefer, physical or digital games? Myself and Paul put that out to the LinkedIn community. And after a week, we ended up having just under 620 votes, nearly 50 comments. I think the reach was around 15,000 people. And we knew it was going to be close. But we didn't realise how close it was going to be. And digital just picked the post at 51 versus 49%. So I think the actual difference was something like 1.7% between the two. But yeah, reading through some of the comments of the sort of the LinkedIn community and indeed some of the comments on Twitter, it's certainly a question, as I'm sure you guys can attest to, that resonates with the gaming community. It's a question which, even though we're about to dedicate some time to discussing it, I'm pessimistic as to whether or not we'll come up with a definitive answer, because I think it's a question which is asked countless times. But in terms of some of the sort of comments that were put on LinkedIn, if I just put one out there, which, I want to kick off with one that caught my eye, really. Someone put on, I worry more about what would happen if Valve somehow goes down or that the servers no longer exist than if my house were to catch fire and all my games were incinerated. I'm physical through and through. So I think more than anything, it sort of poses the question about like server stability, being a slave to sort of the server, things like that. A lot of sort of general comments which came out of the messages that people put on the poll were, physical retains value, so physical games potentially have resale value. There are things such as special editions, and obviously, there's companies such as Super Rare which, have made a name for themselves with, selling games which are like limited edition and sort of special editions. Digital games themselves can be dependent upon, a stable internet connection. There were a couple of comments on the LinkedIn poll that from people who basically said, even though I live in inner city London, I prefer to buy physical because I've got, quite an unstable internet connection. As I've said, it's dependent on servers. And, another question which came out of the poll was, do I actually own the game if it's digital? Which, again, it's a bit of a difficult one to sort of get to the bottom of, really. You sort of go into the whole sort of pot of, are you renting the game? Are you sort of buying a license for the game? It's, it's that question of ownership. So, I mean, who wants to sort of share their opinion, really, on sort of where we're at with this?
I guess I'll take the mic. I think for me, it's a debate that you and I, Warren, have had, and I'm not going to live and die by digital. I really do appreciate physical media. I think it is, as you said, very nostalgic. It is quite nice to have something physically, but it's just the convenience for me of digital that is just the best part. You can have hundreds and hundreds of games on a hard drive, where if you have physical, you need to have the space to store those games. And then it's the effort of, opening the box, putting it in, and, waiting for it to start.
You really do like the convenience.
And then you have to find
it.
it.
In the days of remote on a wire.
Yeah, no. So I'm digital because I'm lazy, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny one you've said there, and a couple of people in the comments suggested, in some respects, that it was a generational thing in terms of a question. I think there are people of a certain age, myself included, who do get quite sort of glossy-eyed and quite nostalgic when faced with a tangible product. I mean, there are people of a certain age, again, myself included, who remember something which died out long ago. Video game manuals, for example. The current generation, I'm generalising slightly, but they don't know the magic of reading a manual before you boot up a game.
On the bus
home. Yeah, and so it is a tricky one in that, like I said, a few people suggested it was a nostalgic thing in that generally a lot of the people that pine after physical or prefer physical is because it's what they grew up with, and they're sort of holding on to that. They're flying the flag for physical because of that. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Sean? What do you think?
I mean, for me personally, it's more of a case of preservation. I understand when people say it's nostalgia, but the fact is, I have a bunch of games here actually. There's some games which you can't buy digitally. So if I don't have this, I have to rely on emulation or piracy, and that brings up a whole different kettle of worms. Yeah. And it's the same with this. There's a generation that aren't aware of William Shatner's Tech War, which is very sad. But yeah, it's the physical thing I love, of course, and having the manual and then be able to look at like William Shatner's beautiful face and all the things that go into it. It's a little bit more than just clicking on a Steam list or on an Epic Game Store list and you just click launch and that's it. But for me, I feel like there's more people kind of coming over this mindset. It's more of a preservation thing. I think the video game industry fundamentally fails on so many different fronts when it comes to preservation. And there's different reasons to why, licensing is usually the biggest problem, especially for your movie license stuff. But fundamentally, I don't think there's another creative media out there that is so reckless with their history. We talk about appreciating how games got here, but then you look at the past and a lot of it you can't get anymore, and especially for PC stuff, you have companies that are like GOG, like Zoom, where they'll work to make the games work on modern-day systems. But aside from that, the accessibility is very difficult, and not everyone's willing to maintain a Windows 95 system or learn how to use DOSBox, and that's where it kind of becomes more of a question of how do we preserve things but also make them accessible, which is why I'm a big fan of we mentioned just before we started Night Dive. They did a great job with Blood Fresh Supply. As an average consumer, you can just download it and there you go to play, but there's different options and they're all through community runs. So anything with like the Doom engine, GZ Doom, you can run many different WADs with a click of a button, but most people kind of find that a little bit intimidating. So the idea of preserving stuff in digital, I don't think you can exclusively talk about preservation as just a physical form, but I do think there is a level of preservation digitally and physically. But undoubtedly, for me, and I think many others, the box version is the ideals of having something physically, and obviously it looks, a lot of people like it on the shelf because it looks nice, and it does give you memories of how things used to be. But fundamentally, for me, it's preservation every single step of the way. Just knowing that it's there and nothing can happen to it, and no one can take it, and I don't need to rely on another service.
You've hit the nail on the head there. Because one of the things I was talking to Paul about was, it's something I've written down. It's the fact that we've given into short-term convenience for the sake of long-term preservation, and that's exactly what you've said. And which I think what surprises me about that is how particularly nostalgic the gaming community seems to be at the moment. Retro is king, and it has been now for the past 15, 20, coming up to 25 years. Just look at the retro video games market. There really is an after sort of value market for sort of retro games. People are investing heavily in retro games. I myself have sort of been interested in collecting video games for a good number of years, and it's become highly competitive. There's a lot of aftermarket consoles made to play original Mega Drive cartridges, SNES cartridges, etc. Analog, for example, make clone consoles based on FPGA technology. And one of the comments, again coming back to the LinkedIn poll, said just look at the music market, how all of a sudden vinyl's done a 180, and people are suddenly interested in this tangible piece of music recording, rather than we live in the MP3 generation, we live in the iPod generation, and yet the vinyl market seems to have exploded in the last 5-10 years. So no, I absolutely agree, and that preservation is something that isn't necessarily always at the forefront of people's minds, especially in sort of the here and now. It's quite difficult for people to think, well, actually, in 15 years' time, I might get bit by the bug and want to play Doom Eternal. Will I still be able to play it? It is a strange one, and I don't know if sort of the service by which games are distributed will start to adapt to that moving forward. To sort of bring you full circle, really, something that you said earlier about preservation in terms of sort of not being able to get a hold of games. The recent closure of the PS3, PSP, and PlayStation Vita digital storefronts by Sony. The newest console of which, the Vita, it's just coming up to 10 years old this year, so could be argued by many that it's old enough. But now there are several games, many games which are effectively lost forever. And before that, another significant one was the Wii Virtual Console. And obviously with the Switch, the Virtual Console model as we knew it kind of died a death, and it became something else completely. And so, yeah, I have to agree that preservation, it's something that when people go out and they want to play the next biggest release, it isn't something that's at the forefront of their mind, but it is something that has to be at the back of everyone's mind moving forward. Otherwise, like you say, it's quite an important part of history which is just going to get forgotten completely.
That's the sad thing. I think it's one of the things I worry about with services like Stadia. It's one, the ownership thing, but also that you might have difficulty because it might just go off the service. And then in terms of games that now, like you were talking about Doom Eternal, if I want to play Doom Eternal's DLC, which was a recent release, Part 1 has now been changed. They made it easier. So we can't even preserve how games were in a digital state. So I think this idea of preservation is also starting to come into digital content. You couldn't buy that DLC physically, but now it's changed, and it's fundamentally made it easier so you don't get the original experience. And you see this with Netflix when they make minor edits to stuff. I think it was what's the film with the mermaids in Splash? There's a scene where you see a butt cheek, and they've now made CGI hair, and I think this is a problem that's starting to come in, that you can't get the original versions of things, even if it's coming directly from the distributor.
Yeah. I mean, again, one of the things I wrote down was, Grand Theft Auto 4, when it was relaunched on digital marketplaces, a lot of the music, due to expired licensing, had been sort of removed and changed and things like that. Another one recently, I had a real sort of hankering to play Marvel Ultimate Alliance, and I hadn't realised at the time that it had been released on modern consoles. But as soon as I found out about it, I realised that it had actually been as quickly delisted as it was posted on stores, and it was less than 2 years, just over 2 years rather, that it was put on the Xbox store and then quietly delisted. And because it was only ever a digital release, admittedly you can play it on older consoles like the Wii and the PS2 and stuff like that, but because it was only a digital release, that now has effectively gone forever. What do you reckon, Jordan?
Much like the poll, I'm very 50-50. I can see, a lot of value on both sides. I think with the main thing for both sides for me is the social element. I think going back to kind of like physical games, such as the walkthrough guides, cheat codes, things like that in magazines that you got with a lot of physical purchases. Also, like things like the midnight launch. These are like social values that you got with actually purchasing physical games. Actually going, pre-ordering a game, being there at a midnight launch, being around people, interacting with people. You don't really see that as much anymore because you can pre-order something online and you get it instantly at midnight rather than having to leave your house.
I was going to say the purchase of the game was an event in itself.
Yeah, exactly. So elements like that I do miss, and it's just like couch co-op. Stuff like that you don't really see anymore because it's just so convenient, and as a consumer, it's easy for us to be remote when we want to play games with our friends now. So it's the social elements that I think that have kind of disappeared over the years with physical and digital copies of games as well. But I think the actual value of holding it in your hand, having it on a shelf like a book collection. It's a visual achievement, and look at Sean's background. It's walking into that room every day. He must feel some kind of like achievement, just looking around, thinking, I'm happy with this collection. This is amazing, And then me clicking on my desktop and just seeing different desktop icons of games that I've got. Yeah, it's an impressive library, and I think we all collect the games. Like, I think everyone's probably got a Steam library full of lots of indie games that they'll probably purchase for about 50p to actual kind of games that are going to cost you around about 50 to 60 quid. But it's an impressive library when you look at it and you show it your friends. But the physical space of showing things is much more visually pleasing. But I think with pre-ordering games, like I said, with physical copies, when you did go and pick something up, it always came with art, it always came with walkthroughs, it always came, depending on what you purchased, things that you can actually hold. I remember buying like Gears of War and Halo kind of editions when I was really kind of into gaming growing up, and actually I've got like boxes of stuff of figurines and full cogs, like metal cogs from Gears of War and stuff like that, and the hard copy editions that were engraved, just like holding those and like actually feeling them, it's kind of it's much more pleasing than just me going onto Xbox Game Pass and downloading Gears of War, when I'd probably get more of a kick from actually going back into that box and picking out my old Gears of War 3 edition.
I think you sort of got very close to a point that I sort of have about physical, and it is a plus point, and it's something that digital can't offer. They've tried to offer it, but it's difficult. Is lending your friends games.
Well, that too, yeah.
You know, definitely. When you were growing up, games weren't cheap, and it was quite common for one friend to maybe get a title and share it amongst 3 or 4 friends. That's gone now with digital. I know they've tried a few different methods of doing that through. I think PlayStation did it a few years ago.
I would say that very practice was quite prevalent at the early days of sort of, the British bedroom coder. The early days of the British games industry was, swapping tapes, swapping floppy disks, and that whole practice seems so archaic when you sort of say, in 2021. It does seem, quite outdated. But I think one thing that I'm sort of sensing from everyone is that there is a certain degree of magic with certain practices like that. That seems to be sort of lost with sort of the digital marketplace. I think by comparison, the digital marketplace, absolutely, it is entirely justified, especially for people who, going back to the LinkedIn poll, potentially move around a lot, don't have the ability to sort of have sort of an impressive games collection and things like that. But I do think it's something which is sort of relatively sterile in comparison, and it's difficult to have that viewpoint and not necessarily sound like an old fuddy-duddy, a relic of a bygone era. It is quite difficult. Well, it's one of those things that as I've got older, and I'm sure this is the same for anyone of my age, you always vow never to come across as old as your parents. And I'm now finding that I'm slipping into that, especially when I'm talking about things which were quite instrumental in my childhood, i.e. sort of video games. And so it is quite difficult to sort of cast an opinion on it and not sound, like you're fractionalizing yourself away from the youth of today, because, by no means am I a voice of the youth of today. But one thing that I wanted to bring up, and I think you were touching upon this a moment ago, Jordan, is that, purchasing physical games themselves, I'm sure we can all agree that, it was quite an event. A lot of games, took quite a great deal of effort in the sort of the way they were presented. Video game manuals, potentially have illustrations, cheat codes, a whole backstory to sort of certain elements of the game and things like that. Do you think, as the digital marketplace and sort of platforms such as Steam have, begun to dominate sort of the way we purchase games now over the past sort of 20 years plus, do you think it's changing how we play games? Because a discussion I've had with my sort of my mate on this issue is that we're sort of not investing as much time in games because of the throwaway nature of them. You know, with things like Xbox Game Pass, you know, I might spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes on a game and then go, oh, well, there's another one to play, and flip from game to game, because it isn't a case of I've bought a purchase, you know, using the reference that you made earlier in terms of, you know, comparing to like a book collection. If you've got a collection of books, generally you don't read a bit of one book and then read a bit of another book and then read a bit. You might do, but you know, if you've got like a big Steam library, or you've got a ton of games installed on your PS4, or you've got a load of games on Xbox Game Pass, is it now encouraging us to be a little bit more, you know, investing less in these games and sort of having a bit more of a short attention span when it comes to investing in sort of games like that?
Massively. I think as generations change, technology changes with it, and I think with that, the nature of how we play games does change with it as well. I mean, you can even look at platforms like Twitch. I think Twitch kind of massively dominates how people play games these days as well, because the influencers on there, they're the ones that are driving the factor of you know, who's playing what. And when you see people stream certain games, whether it's, you know, a local streamer who's a friend, or whether it's a big streamer that you've got, you know, it's got a massive fan base. I think depending on what audiences are interested in and what audience you fall into is dependent on what you play. And I think yeah, what you're saying there, Warren, is right. You're hitting the nail on the head there. I think massively. I mean, when I was at school, for example, it was always one or two games, one or two max, that everyone was playing. Everyone was playing on a multiplayer basis. And then as I left school and went into college, and, you know, I got a bit more social, I wasn't playing games as much. I was revisiting all the games that I wanted to play, but there might have been, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 other games that had come out in the span of time that I wasn't playing games as much. And I felt like I was catching up and having to play games all the time. And I feel like I'm playing catch up every week now with game releases and every year, because there are that many releases of games. It's hard to pick and choose which ones you want to play. And for me, the ones that I do pick and choose are dictated by what my friends are playing usually, because it's, again, coming back to the social value. I play games with my friends so I can keep in contact with my friends, but also doing something that I enjoy. I found it extremely difficult to actually sink myself into a single player campaign these days as I get older, because I just don't have the time to invest, you know, into a single player campaign game. And when I do want to play a game and I am on my own, I find myself revisiting old favorites more than I do actually investing into something new. Because again, if I do purchase something that's a digital copy and I don't like it, I'm stuck with that copy. I can't trade it in like I would be able to physical. I wouldn't be able to trade something in like I would if I had it physically. But on that as well, having physical copies, you know, you're more prone to damaging them or scratching them. And again, that kind of lowers the value of owning that game as well. But it's you know, being stuck with something digital and then not liking it, and then having something physical and being able to trade it with a friend online, on eBay, whatever it is. I think there's a whole lot of different things that change the way we play and buy and purchase games.
I fell victim to that recently. I felt the wrath of digital recently, because I went and bought on Nintendo Switch, I bought the BioShock collection because it was on sale. And then I remembered after I purchased it that I actually already owned it on my Xbox. So I was like, oh, okay. I mean, it wasn't a lot of money. And I was like, well, how do I return it? You can't. There's no way. That's it. Once you've bought it.
I had something similar, massively. I bought Destiny 2's digital deluxe edition. I played it for 2 weeks. It cost me like 95 quid. I never played it again because I sort of like Destiny 1, and I was like, there's nothing there. And then I looked at 2, and I was like, oh, they've massively improved that, because I was a big fan of Halo. And I thought, you know, this is going more in a direction that I'll probably enjoy. I invested 95 quid into something I played for 2 weeks. I'm not getting that back. It was a digital deluxe edition. With a physical copy, I might have been able to keep art. I might have been able to keep actual physical figurines, things like that, walkthrough guides. And then if I didn't like the game, I could sell it on, but keep all that other stuff.
I think this sort of highlights the seemingly disposable nature of how games come across when they're nestled amongst a huge digital library. It's quite difficult in this day and age for a game to stand out. Like you've said, Jordan, I've found it that over the past couple of years with things like PlayStation Plus and Game Pass, every now and then there's been a game which, particularly on Game Pass recently, which, I honestly cannot fault as a service. And I do think PlayStation potentially might have something up the sleeve if, recent reports are to be believed. But, there's been quite a few games over the past couple of years which have been, simultaneously released in stores and on digital platforms and on things like Game Pass. So, it's wrong to say that I've got the game for free because I'm obviously paying into a subscription service. So, I disagree when people say, "Oh, I've got this game for free." You haven't. You're paying for a subscription service. But I've paid. I've got a vastly discounted rate. The last one I played, for example, one that springs to mind. Streets of Rage 4, for someone like me who was a bit of a Sega fanboy growing up, huge fan of Streets of Rage 1, 2 and 3, I didn't have to pay a penny, technically, obviously outside the sort of the Game Pass subscription, for playing Streets of Rage 4, and as a result, I don't think I invested in it half as much as I would have done had I gone out, bought it, brought it back, had it in my hand, put it in and played it. And again, it's difficult to say that without sounding like an old man. But it just the way I approached that game was that it was quite disposable and had, in some regards, less significance than if I actually tangibly owned it as a product. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think stuff like Games Pass, I'm probably going to sound even older. And we've had problems like this since the dawn of deep discounts and stuff like Humble Bundle. You get a vast amount of games for such a low price. My problem with things like Game Pass, I see it's a wonderful service for consumers, but I think there's one thing the games industry is kind of guilty of is we treat one consumership model is the default, and that's it. So you see big companies that'll treat console and PC people exact same way, even though the history and how they consume products and how they value products is completely different. And I think Games Pass is coming to this level where there's just so much stuff, and you touched upon this earlier, there's just so much stuff that it's fundamentally changing how we view the value of a product in a game and the experience. And I'm starting to see this in reviews. So when I get a review code for something and I see in the notes that it's going to be on Games Pass by default, I subconsciously figure that into my review. It's like, if I'm normally reviewing this as a £40 release, I can mount up these things and I can say, well, it's also on Games Pass. And it's the same with Netflix. You say stuff like that. The Netflix exclusives, they have a lot of really trash content, and there's one or two good things. So how do we value that trash content? Normally you would say as a standalone, it's not good quality, this is a flaw, but I get it's part of this service. So is it worth picking up? Is it worth complaining about? Not really. And I've seen people talk about, we were talking about how it changes people, how they play things, how they play games. And I think, the mention of Twitch was something that was very key. I like RPGs. I'm a big fan of RPGs and a big fan of FPSs. And this might be a weird tangent to go on, but you see almost like the streamline of RPGs to the point where it's just selecting perks. There's no character building, there's no world building, I'm just selecting perks. And I feel like we're kind of getting that way now with games and how we consume them. I just have a list and I choose which ones, and those games might not exactly be deep. And I think this is going to be a problem in the long run. We're celebrating, and I see the press celebrate all the things to do with Games Pass, and I get it, I really do. But I do think we're going to run into problems later on down the line where we're now making spam content because it's owned by Microsoft and it's going to be a safe release on Games Pass rather than something that's ambitious and something that's trying to be something different. And I think you also see it based on where the development studio is from. So I'm a big fan of like Eurojank. So stuff like, to me, Kingdom Come Deliverance is one of the best RPGs in the past 10 years because it tried to do something completely different. It was flawed, it was clunky, it broke so many times, but the experience I got from that and the concept was worth all that effort. And you would never really, hear about it in the press. And then you get something like, I guess Skyrim, which is still held to this high standard, or Witcher 3, which I know is from a European company, but Witcher 3 is very much Western focused, and they're praised as these big, glorious things. And one of the good things about Games Pass is it gives you a chance of trying different stuff. So you like Skyrim? well, you can try Kingdom Come Deliverance, and you're not paying £40 for it, and if it sucks, then you're stuck with it. You can try it, and we saw this with the Yakuza series. Yakuza is obviously now getting big in the West, but as soon as it went in Games Pass, so many people were trying that, and they're like, "Oh, there's this new series I've never played before, and now I learn all about it." And it was the same with Wasteland 3. I thought Wasteland 3 was one of the best games of last year. I loved it. Very old school approach. The writing was straight from the golden era of RPGs. So you suddenly had all these people that were used to like Fallout 4 and thought that was amazing. They're like, well, what's this kind of future grim RPG? I don't want to pay for it, but it's on Games Pass, and they try it, and then suddenly they become big fans of Wasteland. But for every success story, I do worry in the long term that we're just going to get kind of inundated with... I don't want to be rude about it, but almost like fluff content, and that's my big concern is we're going to have people that value games based on, will I buy it or will it be on Games Pass? I could pre-order it, but it'll probably be on Games Pass at some point. And it's why I'm not a big fan of Microsoft buying all these companies. I don't think large-scale ownership of multiple studios is good for any industry, especially video games. And with Games Pass being what it is, I do worry for the long-term benefits of how we see the quality of games, what we expect from games. Maybe not so much the ambition. It might be naive. I hope that the safety net that Microsoft provide these studios will allow them to be more creative. But at the same time, it doesn't fill me with confidence just because of how Microsoft have handled studios in the past. So I see this next wave of Game Pass stuff to be bad for preservation in general, especially for game ownership. But a possible pitfall for content and how consumers see products. I think I ranted on a little bit, but it's something I've been sitting on for a while, and I see it more and more, and it does make me worry, and it does make me sound like an old man, like, oh, back in my day, we looked after our games, but I do think we're kind of touching this edge where people will refuse to buy a game and just wait for it to be on Games Pass the same way we used to kind of wait for it to be on Netflix. So we'd wait for this film that we saw on DVD and like, oh, it'll be on ITV one day, It's a very strange approach, but I think it's just human nature in general. Why pay for it when I can get it for a much lower price or free?
I think as consumers we pay for convenience. That's just kind of like human nature now. We pay for convenience because of how fast-paced life can get. And it's the same when we purchase a game. But I think going back to preservation, looking at things like subscription services and not having actual physical ownership. I remember when like cartridge games were very, very cheap. And then within the last 5 years, the prices of cartridge games went through the roof. You could go to places like CEX and they were on the shelves for like 30, 40 quid. Like right next to newer games that were on disc. And I remember like having a stack of PS2 games, for example, and taking them into trade, and I'd get like I must have paid collectively over £100 for all the stack, but then I'm only getting about 10 quid for all of them. But I imagine in another 10 years I could probably fish out my PS2 games, and then they're going to be worth like 30 quid again. So does a subscription service kind of stop that completely? I mean, the last games that were actually on physical disc are probably going to be Xbox One, PS4, PS5, and Xbox Series X are going to completely eliminate that eventually. Are they just going to become a games studio, a games company that just move to, instead of creating consoles, do they move to just making PCs, because everyone's kind of moving from PC to console and console to PC?
I was going to say it's very interesting, sort of what you're sort of hinting at in terms of, obviously, if we're talking about the major players at the moment in terms of the current console market, we've obviously got the Series X, Series S, PS5. Both Microsoft and PlayStation have invested heavily in an entirely digital equivalent of the current gen consoles. And I think more so, I'm curious what, in another 7-8 years, what their successors are going to be like. And in terms of, like Sean was saying, in terms of, the very way that people see games and consume games, how that in itself is going to sort of determine the next shape of how we, of effectively how Sony and Microsoft want to provide these digital experiences. It's very, very uncertain, and I think, if anything, we've sort of posed more questions than answer, which, I think deep down we always knew was going to happen. But
time will tell. Time will tell. As the old cliche goes, time will tell.
To try and provide a different opinion on digital, I see digital as a positive when it comes to accessibility for some people. Games are expensive, especially rare games, and so use a family of 5, can't afford a £60 game every month, whenever there's a new release. So things like Game Pass offer a new, fresh way to allow their kids or somebody of low income to access these titles. So I think that is a positive from these digital platforms. I think some people might call it sort of gentrification, or sort of trying to take it away from the real fans of gaming. But I think it is trying to open up more doors to people who aren't as passionate as us, I guess, more casual gamers who might not necessarily want to pay 60 quid, 50 quid a pop just to try a game. So I don't know what anybody else's thoughts are on that.
Do you think that could go full 360? I mean, look at a company like Blockbuster, for example. It was a renting service for videos, and it was for people that couldn't afford to buy films and video on video or DVD at a full price. They could rent it, and if they liked it, they might go and purchase it. If not, they've kind of saved money on not fully purchasing something. The subscription services like Game Pass are very similar. You are renting games, you're not owning them.
Yeah.
Could that, just like Blockbuster did, fizzle and burn eventually? Could it come to a point where, companies are just not making enough money from renting services anymore, subscription services? I mean, just on subscription services, kind of losing the sentimental value of actually wanting to play video games. Do you know when you go on Netflix, how long do you scroll through Netflix before you actually find something you want to watch? Game Pass and Steam libraries, things like that, are very similar. I scroll and scroll and scroll before I actually see something that I want to click on and play. And sometimes I do find myself going on my old kind of like PS2 and playing something like Shadow of Colossus, because
old question,
I know I'm going to enjoy it.
I'm going to say it's that old question of is it possible to have too much choice?
Exactly.
I think too much choice is good for sort of diversification and giving everyone the opportunity to, get their title out there. But I think in sort of the place we're at the moment with sort of the predominantly digital marketplaces, it is quite easy to become quite overwhelmed, which is why, as we've said, it's quite easy to spend longer scrolling than it is playing, to spend longer selecting, or to flip from one game to another and not necessarily invest as much as we previously used to, sort of pre the explosion of digital marketplaces.
I think in terms of what we're talking about, allowing more people to play the games, I don't think anyone who seriously enjoys or loves video games would ever try to close the gate on that. I think the worry comes from that these subscription models wouldn't be an option, they would become the default, especially how aggressively Microsoft are purchasing, and Ubisoft have their subscription service, and EA have theirs, and we see this in the film industry, in TV especially. It used to be you would buy Sky and there you go, and now if I want to watch the football, I have to have a Sky package, I have the BT package. If I want to watch 90 Day Fiancé now, I got to watch Discovery Plus. Disney has all theirs, and Disney has so many different things. So we're now cutting it up. So while I get that it is, it's a great thing, like I said, for consumers, especially for people that aren't as, I hate using the term like hardcore, but it's the easiest way to refer it to. It's a great service for them. But the worry is that it'll become the default, and then in the long run, I don't know how great that would be for the consumer. But at the same time, I think mainstream consumers aren't really ever thinking about these kind of things. DRM is still a hot topic within like very hardcore circles, working for Zoom. All their games are DRM free. Most people don't know what DRM is. Most people don't care. Most people will never care. As long as they get their convenience, they get their product, they don't mind, but it's still always going to be there. So I think these kind of discussions that we're entertaining will engage with people that really care about video games and work within the industry. But for the mainstream, they just won't care. It's the same with stuff like Spotify, and Bandcamp. Like, well, not Bandcamp so much. We hear about Spotify and the money that the artists get is so little, but most people don't care about that. Most people don't care about the deals Netflix cut. Most people don't care. As long as they get their product, that's all they care about. And that's where the concern comes from, that this becomes the default. And, I guess this is part of what you're saying there. We sound old. It becomes part of the default, and how it was is eliminated, and ownership is reduced to nothing but an active or an inactive subscription.
I'm just envisaging this Mad Max post-apocalyptic scene where we're telling the youth of today, where we're holding our Sega Saturns with a copy of Panzer Dragoon Saga, saying, "I told you so."
From clearly, Sean and Warren are the ones promoting the physical here. But what solutions would you recommend, or what direction do you think people should try and go into preserve and bring back a little bit more of that joy around physical?
I think we need more like the NVM in Sheffield. We need the National Video Game Museum. We need the profile of preservation to be out there. We don't want to necessarily suggest that it comes upon, it's put upon the consumer, because it's quite a responsibility and quite a burden. But I do think the awareness of preservation is something that, even the major players like Microsoft and Sony, it needs to be recognised. A lot of people, in light of, we were saying earlier, Sony shuttering the PlayStation Network stores for PS3, etc. A lot of people are saying, preserve your rich heritage, because it's a heritage worth preserving. It's such a crying shame, and not only is it just something which is a shame because people have got such fond memories of them. It's a shame because it's not to be not to put it on a pedestal, but it's effectively it's a history lesson in sort of the evolution of technology. It's indicative of changing tastes. It's indicative of changing technologies, and it's something that absolutely has to not be lost, because it's we can learn so much from it. And I do think we live in a society where as soon as something's fallen out of favour, it's quite easy to forget about it. That is human nature, and as something we've seen recently with as we've said earlier, the resurgence of sort of vinyl market in the music industry. There will come a time when people start to look back, potentially through rose-tinted glasses, with the nostalgia hats on, and think, oh, actually, I quite fancy playing that again, or I fancy quite watching that again, or listening to that again. And we don't want to get to that stage and think, oh, actually, because of the way games were distributed 15, 20 years ago, we actually now can't. They just, it needs to be recognised that preservation is key. Teams of people have spent hours upon hours of their lives to, and sweat and blood has gone into these products. Every video game, no matter what the critical reception, no matter what the commercial reception, it genuinely needs to be celebrated, and it needs to be preserved. But
I think. Sorry.
I was going to prompt something in terms of actual materials to make video games. So with hard copy, obviously, there's a lot of different materials that go into making a disc, plastic packaging, things like that. So I think some studios and a lot of people who are quite for recycling and pro planet, that sort of thing, would suggest that digital saves on materials like plastics and is cheaper. And I think a lot of studios would say it is cheaper for us to not create physical copies. It's easier for us to create digital copies, which means more money can be made and put into making more games. So I think there's another argument there for what people might have against having hard copies against digital.
I understand that, but at the same time, I going back to what you were asking, how the industry can address it, I do think there's fundamental failures from companies. And if you look at the attitude of Sony recently, which I think is, I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I kind of find it disgraceful. I can't remember. It's one of the higher ups, and he was talking about the possibility of Sony supporting backwards compatibility, etc., etc. And he said that he was at a Sony event recently, and he replayed PS1 games, PS2 games, and he thought to himself, who would play this? And that makes me highly concerned because there is a problem in the industry where you have a lot of people that are recruited in higher positions that aren't video game people, don't have connection to the industry, and so they make business decisions that make sense, but it also destroys the history. And it is history, and it's not just history of technology, but it's also history of culture. It's bizarre to me that Britain, UK has this great long history of video games, and we simply don't care about it. The days of the BBC Micro, the Commodore 64, your Amstrads, your Spectrums, where people were literally making the next big thing in the back of their rooms. All these stories completely gone because we look at it and we see it as something as a novelty or as an aesthetic. I think it's sad, but that's where we are. In terms of the wastage stuff, I do agree, and that is a problem. I think Sony's even addressing this problem currently. They're looking into doing recycled plastics for their cases. But this is just one of the problems whenever you create something physical is how much waste that's going to go in there. At the same time, I know a lot of the companies that talk about these also run a lot of physical merchandise stuff, so press kits, and they send out goods that aren't particularly environmentally friendly. So it starts to beg the question: is this an excuse, or is this just something that's a convenience? It starts to divide them, and the optics go wild. But I do think, in terms of addressing the direct question, is it shouldn't be left up to the consumer to preserve the history of an industry. No other industry does this. It's never expected of consumers to look after this, but time and time again, that's what's happening with the museums, with the collections. I'm part of a lot of different communities where there's certain things which you just simply cannot buy now, just one-offs that have ended up in the hands of a consumer. There was a copy of, I think it was Castlevania, which has popped up on eBay in America. That's
on the Dreamcast.
For insane amount of money, and that's a private collector. And while people are complaining that it's a private collector, that you shouldn't have that, you should donate it to a museum as such. The problem is that that's a situation that's happened. That situation should never happen because the industry should be better at looking after their creations. And it's a shame, and I know there's a lot of cultural differences from how Japanese companies might preserve history and see video game preservation, and indeed copyright. This is we start going into questions of piracy and emulation. Is emulation right? Is piracy correct? Is it correct in this case? There's companies that only exist today because of piracy. Like CD Projekt, for example, they only exist because at the start it was very hard to get Western technology, Western games, and a whole bunch of European companies could only get access to this by pirating it, and that was their form of preservation. And I think if we overlook all these things and just say, well, I like convenience, it's a little sad. But I think, again, it's worth remembering. You have to take my comments with a pinch of salt, because I love physical games and I'm all about, DRM-free stuff. But I do feel there would be a great sadness if in 10 years, 20 years' time, I can't show someone a game and how things used to be because there's no way of playing it. For example, there's a bit of an age difference between me and my partner, about 8 years, 9 years, and I'm a little bit before my time. I'm only 30, but I collect stuff from years ago. So when I showed her the original Commodore 64 disc of Wasteland, she's like, "What the hell is this? What's this big alien-looking disc thing?" And then we sat down. I was able to explain to her how it was, explain Commodore 64 discs and cassette tapes. And suddenly she's like asking questions and interested. And if we lose this, we're losing not just games that are printed on it, but as you said, history, technology, how we got there. And I think you can never really truly appreciate something unless you know how you got there.
Absolutely.
Well, in terms of preservation, then, what if I want to propose a question to you there? What if something like a natural disaster was to happen, a house fire or something like that, or an earthquake or whatever, and you lost everything in that room that you're in now? Can things be insured to bring back what you have? Are you going to be able to replace what you have?
You can replace some of them. Probably not. It'd be a lot harder, but again, I think I mentioned this earlier. I think there's different forms of preservation. You can have digital preservation where something is kept on a digital format, but the companies that we're talking about and how we're talking about the general attitudes is that's not even happening. Like there's codes of games that just disappears and it's gone forever. So I think when we talk about preservation, we should also entertain and understand that by preservation, it's not strictly physical. There's a digital preservation, which the industry's failing on, and physical preservation, which they're also failing on. And that's where the frustrations come from. Is as an industry, I don't understand how we can spend millions upon millions on stupid stuff and then, oh yeah, the past, forget about it. And it's a strange phenomenon, but I hope it changes.
As an advocate for someone who wants to preserve things, then would you ever donate anything from your collection?
I've always said towards the end of my life, whenever that may be, and hopefully something doesn't crash in, towards the end of my life, I would give my stuff to my partner, and then I would hope that, because she also feels the same, that she would donate it to a museum or a charitable cause that preserve stuff, because I honestly do think it would be sad, because we miss out on so much. There's games now, like the ideals, like I was talking about RPGs. People's ideals of the best RPGs are stuff like The Witcher and Skyrim, which are, they look great and they sound great and they play wonderful, but there's a lot of depth that's lacking. Like, for example, you won't get the same storytelling experience as you would in Planescape. You won't get the same storytelling experience as you would in Baldur's Gate, or even look at the Fallout series. Their tone has completely changed now. So for me, it would be very sad that we can't look back and experience them and then compare and contrast and get a better understanding of how things were. And I mean, just look at the amount of times people are being inspired by things from the past. Some of the biggest films, some of the biggest music currently. I know in the metal scene, there's a lot of bands that are really taken from, power metal and thrash metal. And we look at games in the Boomer Shooter, for example. Boomer Shooter Twitter is full of it. We look at stuff like Dusk and New Blood Interactive. They're all inspired by the past. So if there's no past to draw from, then I feel like you'd be robbing yourselves of some true quality.
I do think a lot of companies have a copy and paste culture these days. There isn't too much kind of evolution, with video games. And I think Ubisoft, for example, they're very kind of guilty of that. I think with how fast the video games industry is growing, it's is the biggest kind of entertainment industry. It makes more money than music, television, film combined. And I think with that, there's become kind of a bit of laziness with big conglomerate studios that are in this copy and paste culture. I mean, look at Assassin's Creed titles, for example. I mean, the latest one, Valhalla, had a few differences, but again, it's kind of there is a lot of copy and paste culture, and I think with that, you are losing a lot of value of what video games used to be and are in its essence.
With that, a lot of it's safety. I don't play a lot of Ubisoft games, but I will defend them because the scale and cost of AAA, they have to ensure that they hit the biggest market. And unfortunately, this comes what we're talking about with how people view games, consumer habits is. And as you said earlier, like you yourself don't have a lot of time to spend in single player games, so people won't have as much patience for something that requires a lot of time for you. And this was one of the biggest complaints I would see about Kingdom Come Deliverance. That game doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't treat you as a messiah. It's like, you're Henry, you're a peasant, you gotta go and learn stuff, and people just aren't into that. So when it comes to the safety, they got to try and hit that X amount of value, and it's one of the reasons why I feel a lot of people become so disillusioned with AAA, and they feel closer to indie and middle market, because that's usually where you get your ideas from, and the higher concepts, rather than this is shiny, this is nice, you're familiar with this, enjoy it. It's kind of like the same with the Marvel films, I guess. They're never bad, but it's always the same thing.
Yeah. I'm just conscious of our initial plan was to sort of aim at around 30 minutes. So we'll try and sort of bring it to a bit of a conclusion, because I'm sort of just listening intently to see if there is a way of potentially summarising some of the things that we've sort of discussed. I mean, by no means, unfortunately, it could be said, have we've come up with a definitive answer to the question, because I do think it's a lot more multifaceted than not necessarily that we all knew it was a deep sort of treasure trove of sort of different ideas to sort of wade through. But in terms of summarising, am I right to say that obviously digital marketplaces, none of us hand on heart, are entirely against them. Convenience is something which, it's human nature to sort of find sort of the easiest option. It is. But with that in mind, it has to be sort of held in as much value in tandem with sort of the concept of preservation. And if there's one thing we sort of really want to take from this is, we're kind of hoping that, as you've said, Sean, the heavy hitters in the games industry need to recognise the need for preservation, as well as the consumer. Because if history's taught us one thing, it's that eventually the consumer will come around to recognising the worth of products that once were. We will pine after what once was, and unfortunately, we're not careful and preservation isn't at the forefront of people's minds, we will get to a stage where we're not able to enjoy sort of titles from bygone eras purely because the means to consume them no longer exist. So am I sort of right in that summary? Or?
No, that sounds good.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, completely agree.
Well, I didn't expect a full unanimous agreement on that one. So, well, thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you so much, Paul, as always.
I'll do what I can.
But yeah, absolutely fantastic. Hopefully we'll be able to get together at some point and discuss another hot topic.
Yeah, excellent.
Lovely.